Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining in and being a part of our study. It's been a while for our Letters from a Man Called James series, our Midweek series. Um, it's been several months, and so I apologize that there's quite the gap between the previous week and this week. There's a lot going on, and things just got busy, and so I had to focus a lot of my time elsewhere instead of the preparations for the online format. Um, we had a lot of great things that have been happening here at the church, just really exciting. And so what basically kind of what boiled down to is I had some personal stuff that I had to take care of off site. I had to go out of state and for a couple of weeks and take care of some things. And when we got back through the summer hit and there was some shuffling of staff here at the church, and so I had to. I'm covering some other ministries here in the church as well, and so just a lot going on that way. And then of course we had all the summer camps went on, and then we've had the 80th anniversary service for our church in August, and just with the beautiful celebration of the 80th. And during all that time too, we have been working on expanding our platform in the sanctuary. And so now the platform is completely transformed. It's completely new. It looks great. It's very beautiful. If you're in the area, I would like to invite you to come out and see our platform. And just with everything that we've been able to do to it, it looks fantastic, and it makes a lot more room for our worship team, and greater visibility when it comes to ministering the word. And so, wonderful to be a part of. And so, needless to say, that was all the stuff that's been going on, with just our family needs that had to be taken care of, and just a bunch of other stuff. Um, my personal stuff I had to do at the beginning of summer. I had to go out right as soon as the school year ended. I had to go out to Washington State for funerals and for family reunions and that sort of thing, and which was great being back in the Northwest. Don't get me wrong; it was very beautiful. Lots of fun seeing old friends and family, and just being to be with everybody. It was really really good, and so. Yeah, so it was just wonderful. And then we came back, and I had to take care of our youth ministry, and then the platform edition, as well as preparing for all the camps and preparing for um, the 80th celebration service. All of that just kind of helped push things back. And before I knew it, it was so far gone, and I realized I was like, well, we haven't finished the letter from a man called James, and so we're gonna be finishing that, and so it's gonna be really good. Um, Hope you really enjoy this particular study as we've gone through these things together, and I hope you find it very very fruitful. Now, last time we were here, and the beauty of the online format is that you can go to the previous entry. Um, and so, week 8, we talked about the warning against worldliness, and that is a wonderful thing. So, if you missed whatever all of chapter 4, James chapter 4, and everything that contained, that you can find that in the previous video. Um, and that should just be one of the links at the end of this one. If you're watching it on YouTube, if you're on the app, it should just be just the previous episode right there. And so I hope that you find that very very informative, and that way you can watch that and then get caught up right away for James chapter 5. Now, we're not going to go through the entirety of James chapter 5. It's a lengthy chapter, and I want to give every bit of it its proper due. And so I want to make sure that as we go forward into this together, that it is wonderful, it is productive, um, and that we can have adequate time to discuss it. Whether we discuss it for half an hour or for a full hour, it doesn't matter. But I want to make sure that you get a lot out of that. So go ahead and break out the notebooks, break out the Bible, get your coffee, your tea, or whatever you feel like drinking, a cup of water even, and let's just jump right in to this portion. We're only going to do a few verses, in James chapter 5. And so we're going to jump to this portion here, and we're going to start reading in verse 1. So I want to make sure that you're ready. You got your Bible out, you got your notebook, you got your drink, and you're ready for diving into the scriptures together. So we're going to start in verse 1, okay, beginning of the chapter. We're just going to read the first 3 verses here just right now, just as a preliminary, okay? And I'm reading out of the NIV. NIV Study Bible is what I'm using today. If you have a different translation, different version, that's wonderful. You know, you're going to see different words there that are wonderful and impactful, and so utilize them. It is a wonderful thing to compare these. Paraphrases are adequate. Well, paraphrases are good, but having a good translation also helps. And so, just jump right in with us. So, James 5, verse 1. Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. We're going to pause right there. Kind of he doesn't beat around the bush. He kind of hits it very, very quickly. He's not very tactful. He's just calling it right out, which is important. I mean, I think sometimes we can be overly tactful. We can be overly sensitive that we minimize the real weight. We minimize the real. We minimize the real seriousness of the issue. Sometimes I think we can be overly tactful, overly sensitive so much that the severity of the issue is missed. And so I do appreciate that in James, that he doesn't call it real tact. He just sits there and calls it right out, which is really good. He's telling them, the wealthy, initially to weep and to wail. Okay, he starts out with that, weep and wail. Now I want to point out to this that this is not just crying out for repentance. Okay, this is not, hey, you need to repent. That's implied, but it's not a positive weeping. Okay, it's the choice of words and the surrounding context, which we read there in verse 3, and in verse 1 there as well, the misery that is coming. That surrounding context tells us that this weeping and wailing is because of judgment, because something terrible is coming, because of their misdeeds and what they've done wrong with as far as the wealthy is concerned. Misery is going to come on them because of this, and so they need to weep and wail because of that. And so he says that, and that is there, and it's note right there. It says, note the misery that is going to come, the misery that's going to come upon you. And this amazes me, is because mankind, we tend to think of wealth, whether it be financial or possessions or whatever the case may be, we tend to think of that as the big fix. We tend to think of that as the solution. Well, there's different varying types of wealth. You know, like I mentioned, possessions and finances. And we have different degrees of wealth. You know, some people have high capacity, medium capacity. I mean, there's a wide variety. Even here in the U.S., even in the midst of inflation, we're still considered a very wealthy nation. Even with all the stuff that's going on and the stuff that's happening around us, we're still a very, very wealthy people, globally speaking. And so it's fascinating that we believe and we view the our wealth and our ability as the fix for hardship, as the solution when it comes to facing disasters. The idea of just throwing more money at the issue, which is really hilarious when we really consider it. But there's more on that there. Ironically, this kind of thinking actually has gone on for quite a while. It's gone on since the beginning, really. This idea that if I just throw more money at this, if I throw, hey, we can just have the debt forgiven, or if we raise the taxes, we can pay for that. Or so the idea is it's all connected to our wealth. And so we try to use our wealth to fix these things. Um, However, wealth and all of it does have a purpose. Divinely speaking, wealth has purpose. Um, there's a reason that the Lord abundantly gives. There's a reason that the Lord blesses his people. There's a reason why the wicked can grow wealthy. There's a reason the righteous can grow wealthy. But there is responsibility when it comes to our wealth, and that's what we're kind of looking at here when we look at the warnings to rich oppressors. When we're looking to warnings to the wealthy, it's vital for us to recognize that our finances have purpose, and that's important there. In verses 1 and 2, he points out, the author points out something very important for us in verses 1 and 2. It says, in ancient times, wealth was given, wealth is given in primarily 3 areas. Okay, and we'll work our way backwards. You have silver, you've got gold, and you have got apparel. You've got clothing, and so those 3 areas come together and bring about wealth. In ancient times, having certain colored clothing was a status, just because the cloth dyes were extremely valuable and extremely hard to get, or dangerous to process, or the same things that they are now. And different wools with the rarity of the sheep, and so the type of clothing that one wore and the color that one wore was a status symbol. And they would use that, and so they would use cloths to barter with. They would use gold to barter with. They would use silver to barter with, and that's the means of how the wealthy would utilize it. And so he makes an important thing here that he says about it. In verses 2 and 3, James, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, he imparts this bit of wisdom for us. He says in verses 2 and 3, he says it twice. In verse 2, he says, your wealth is rotted, and moths are going to eat your clothes. Moths have eaten it. That past present tense, have eaten your clothes. The idea is that it's not being worn, so it is being wasted away. And then in verse 3, he talks about, transitions to gold and silver, and he says that they are corroded. So we see that the cloth is being eaten by bugs, and then we see that the gold and the silver are being corroded, which is fascinating that he makes that particular moment. He clears that up, and here's why that's important. And here's what we can take away, especially now looking at our possessions now. In verses 2 and 3, wealth just sitting naturally degrades. And that's what it's so important for us to get that, because I think sometimes we think with our finances, when we put it into banks, we put our wealth into banks, we put our investments, we put that stuff out there, and we just sit on it. Well, in ancient times, the stuff that sat, it would begin to corrode, it would begin to waste away. It's kind of like a car. If I can use that as an example, a vehicle sitting and not being used. And I've seen this all over the country, not just here in Minnesota when it comes to the salt and the snow, but in other areas as well, even where it's dry for vast amounts of the year, that vehicles that just sit, it's like the whole vehicle actually begins to break down faster while it's just sitting. When it's not being used, when it's not living out its purpose, that the item just begins to break down. And and that's important. The people that James is writing to, and not just in his immediate audience, but even into his greater audience, it's important to note that many times when it comes to wealth and it comes to um, acquiring it, a lot of times it involves stockpiling. It involves acquiring for oneself and sitting on it, um, which is is kind of terrible when we want to think about that. And see that when it comes to wealth, that's one of not the only, but one um, of very real sins regarding wealth is God's you get wealth is for the believer at least. You receive wealth for a purpose. And when you just sit on that purpose and you do not utilize it, you don't use it, it corrodes and it wastes away. Jesus told a parable in the Gospels, and he references in this parable. It's called the parable of the three talents, and I'm going to paraphrase it there instead of turning to it. I'm going to just kind of paraphrase it here. Jesus Jesus tells a story. He says a certain master is going to go away for a season, and so he gathers to himself three of his trusted servants, and he takes those servants, and to the one servant he gives a large amount of resource, a large talent portion. To the second servant, he gives a medium. He gives another amount another amount of resources, talents to use. And to the third, he gives another portion of talents, of resources to use. And he says, go and use these, steward this wisely, and then I will return. And so the three in this parable, the three individuals take their respective resources, their respective talents, and they go and do something with it. And so the first one takes his portion and he goes and he invests it, utilizes it, spends it, and produces a return with it. And the second one does the same thing, takes his allotted amount, invests it, uses it, gets a return on it. And then then the third one takes it, and it says that he buries it in his backyard. Okay, he takes his resources, his talents, the things that he's received, and effectively just puts it under the house. And then Jesus says, the master returned from his journeys, returned from his endeavors, and he came back, and he goes to the first servant and says, okay, what have you done with what I've given you? And so the first servant, hey, you gave me this amount. It was wonderful. Thank you. I invested it. Look here. I was able to double it. Here's the full process. And so he gives everything back to the master. The master says, well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter now into the rest of your master. And so that first servant gets to go and enter into rest. Then you have the second servant. He goes before the master and says, master, look, thank you. I took those resources, I invested, I worked with it, I double it. Here's the resources, here's the additional, and he gives that back to the master. And the master says the exact same thing. Well done, my good and faithful servant. Enter now into your rest. And then he gets to the third one, and the third one is really kind of distinct. Different than the rest. The third servant comes up and says, I knew that you were harsh. I knew that you were very wise, that you were very accountable with what you give out and what you handle. So I held on to it, and here's the full amount what you've given me. And the master's response to that servant is harsh. Why didn't you use it? Why didn't you do anything with it? Why did you sit on it when you know I gave it to you for a purpose? And that servant, even though he gave the full account back to the master, that servant, it says that he was cast out where there is weeping of teeth. So it's a very interesting dynamic in that parable, and that's important for us to gather, because we have to recognize that when God gives us resources, it's for a purpose. It's not just so that we can be wealthy for wealthy's sake. It's not just so that we can have a great life now. There's purpose behind those things, and that's important. and recognizing those details. And so that's an important thing here when we look at this particular principle as it relates to James chapter 5, when he says your silver and gold are corroded, you have not touched it, you have not done anything with it, is what he's saying. And then in the moths eating the clothes, we know that when we put clothes into storage, moths will get to them. We know that clothes sit; they're not being moved around, and they're just sitting. That moths get in there and destroy the clothes. I mean, why we have mothballs. And so even the phrase "put them in mothballs" is because I'm going to store it. I don't want anything to we're going to store and put it away. I don't want anything to get in and to destroy what I'm storing. And yet, in this passage here, it talking about the rich people's wealth, he's saying it's rotten. Moths have eaten it. Gold and silver is corroded. And it's because they were storing it. It's because they weren't using it. And there's more on that in verse 4. We'll see more of this principle in this next verse. And so let's read these things. Because again, God gives it for his purposes. And so we want to read this in verse 4. It says, "Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty." This is a very interesting passage. The wages that you failed to pay the workers. The wages you failed to pay the workers. It's almost as if the wages, the wages know where they're supposed to go. But wait a minute, they're an inanimate object. How can they know? And so it's not so much the wages know where they're supposed to go. It's that heaven knows where the wages are supposed to go. It's so funny. We can get so caught up in how money flows and tracking books. Sometimes we can get so caught up and so accurate about how our books are accounted for, not realizing that heaven also keeps a track of our finances, that heaven keeps a track with how we use our wealth and how we use our talents, that there is a tracking there as well. And so heaven knows where the wages, where the finances are supposed to go. Not just where we think they go, not just where we want them to go, but heaven knows where they're supposed to go. And so I find that really interesting there. And sometimes we use the excuse that, well, I'm saving it for a rainy day, or I'm saving, in case things go sideways, if they go south, any kind of those scenarios on why we want to have wealth, or what do we do that for. There's reasons for that. But what happens is that heaven knows where the money's supposed to go. It's so funny. As a minister, tithes can be a very, very sensitive issue when we talk about tithings and offerings. I've heard a wide variety on of individuals, a wide variety on things of how tithes are supposed to happen, and that some people say it's not in the New Testament. Only giving to the poor is in the New Testament. And then you see tithing is only an Old Testament thing. When it comes to paying ministers, I've heard people say, well, God will take care of them. God will pay them. And then I've also heard the comments, oh, they have got other jobs. They have other means that they can do it. And so there's such a wide variety there. But when I look at this passage, and it kind of struck me differently as I was looking over this, is that it says that the wages, I'm going to read this again here. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord. The cries of the harvest have reached the ears of the Lord. In the Old Testament, the tithes and the offerings were actually for a purpose. And the reason they were brought to the storehouses was to take care of the Levites and the priests. So in the Old Testament, the setup of the priests and the Levites, they did not receive any inheritance of land. And so everything that they utilized to take care of their families was from the worship of the Lord. That's how God set it up, is like, we can't sit there and take our tithe offering, write out our money to the Lord, seal it in our envelope, lick it, take a slingshot and sling it into the air. It doesn't work that way. Or, are we going to put it on a special little plate and then go to the altars at the church and lay them down at the platform and say, okay, Lord, here's your offerings, and watch the offerings completely evaporate? No, God uses wealth and finances to to take care of the needs of his servants. In the New Testament, it says, shall, pay a worker his due, and that shall you muzzle the ox while it treads the grains. And the common practice was, no, you don't muzzle the ox. Let the ox chew on what grains he has available while he is doing the work that you have him for. And so that's a really important thing right there. And so it's fascinating. On the one hand, it's really important. We see here this stockpiling, and what's beautiful is that God hears the cries of the harvesters. He knows where they go, and when somebody is not being paid, when the appropriate accounting is not taking place, God knows. And that the cries of those that we owe finances to, whether it's recognized or not, the cries that we owe offerings to reach the Lord. And so this is a reference here of more stockpiling, okay? It references so much more of the stockpiling. Instead of meeting people's needs, instead of meeting the needs in the church, instead of meeting needs in the community, instead of doing those things, instead of paying the workers their due, instead of giving it where it needs to go, we stockpile it and we hold it back for the sake of self. And that is another sin that's referenced in that area there too. And so he transitions from there, and now we're going to read verses 5 and 6. Okay? Verses 5 and 6, it says, you have lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent ones who was not opposing you. Now, so James goes on to talk about the wealthy regarding their practices. And he references two things in verse 5, your luxury and your self-indulgence. Now, these two things, your luxury and your self-indulgence, they both have the same common denominator. And that common denominator that is found right there is actually self-comforts. It's about self. It's the grandizing of yourself. It's the prideful acquirement. It's the what makes my comforts, what makes me feel good, what do I want? And so I indulge in self. I indulge in my luxuries, what makes me feel good. It's a really big important here. And this is terrible because when it comes to luxury, when it comes to self-indulgence, what it is really and honestly is the fueling of pride. It's the fueling of pride. Instead of using it to meet the needs of others, instead of using it to meet the needs of the church and what God has ordained for it to be, what happens is that the wealth that one acquires is used on self possessions, increasing the possessions of the wealthy. And the thing that we have to realize too is that this is just another form of hoarding. When it comes to luxury, when it comes to self-indulgence, this is just another form of hoarding. It's fascinating here in the West, and you don't see it in too many other countries necessarily, is this idea of storage units. Now they can serve a great purpose, but what's fascinating to me is that there are individuals who have multiple storage units, and also they still have a full house as well. It's like the Hoarders. There was a show called Hoarders, or something on TV, on something like that. But what it is the acquiring of more luxuries, acquiring of more wealth, the acquiring of more possessions. This is another form of hoarding. I'm acquiring and bring all these things in. I'm applying all this stuff, whether it's for a purpose or not. I'm acquiring these things for myself, and that's another form of this. James points out the fact and references that what this whole idea of hoarding and acquiring more possessions, James points out so beautifully the spiritual equivalent of what's happening there. And he says it, he doesn't beat around the bush. He says it right there at the tail end of verse 5. He says, you have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. Oh my. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. And that is in reference to this idea of just this building ones up in their possessions and acquiring much more. Um, Fattened for slaughter. You know what they would do in those days when the cattle would be fattened? It would be just added more for the sacrifice, uh, more for the judgment, more for the fire, more for the eating. And so it talks about the day of slaughter. It says, hey, now this is the animal's ready to go. And so basically it's adding to your list, your rap sheet of why you're being judged or what's going on. It adds to it. And he references that. And I think that's really interesting. We tend to, it's something to think about when we look at that. Verse 6 is a really interesting thing here, and there's many different commentaries when it comes to verse 6. There's many different ideas and thoughts regarding it. It says in verse 6, you have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. They use the word innocent in the NIV. Some will say righteous one. And I want to point out a couple things here. For starters, the word one, or innocent one, righteous one, it's not capitalized, it's lowercase, indicating he's not necessarily talking about Christ. It's not about the Jesus Christ and the Holy One. It's not necessarily about him, but because it's singular, we can look at this singular reference and we can see ultimately that he's probably, and many theologians may agree with this, that he's actually probably referring to a particular class of people. So if he's referring to a particular class, we see that description right there, the innocent one, so the righteous one. So he's talking about the righteous people. You have condemned and murdered the righteous one, and they did not oppose you. This is the idea, is the actions and the behaviors of the wealthy and what they have done have brought about this this idea, this level of suffering upon the righteous ones. And it says they did not oppose. We can hold them back when it comes to our possessions. Many times when it comes to our wealth, we hold them back for many variety of reasons. Rainy day, holding them on for many things. But when it comes to those who have been given wealth, whether those who have acquired wealth, those who have been given wealth, that it is for a purpose. Especially if you're a follower of Christ Jesus. James 5 it really hits it on the nail. We don't want to just sit on the talents and the resources God has given us, that he really has given them to us for a purpose, for a reason. And that's important to grasp. And it's not something, wealth, when it comes to that, it's not that we are to be completely blessed and acquired much wealth. God gives it to whom he desires to give it. And that's the way it is. But also at the same time, wealth is not something to fear. It's not something to be avoided. Like, we shouldn't be living on poverty for poverty's sake, but we should not acquire wealth for wealth's sake. And so that's important there to see that. And and that's vital. That God does something. God has a purpose for wealth. God has a purpose for why he gives out his finances, why he gives out wealth, why he does those things. But they should never be sought after. They should never be feared. They should be respectful and recognize that God's got a purpose for those things. What is wrong when it comes to wealth is making people suffer, making individuals, making those things. I say suffer, but I'm trying to think of a better word that I could probably use. But really, it's when it comes to our wealth, and we are neglecting worship with our wealth, and we are neglecting the needs that we can responsibly meet, when we are neglecting the workers, when we are neglecting where things need to go, um, that's a very, very harsh thing. And that's what James is referencing here in verse 5. And he references it, and he's like, you're not doing the very reason that you have this amount of wealth is to do something with it, and to stockpile it, to just hoard it, and do nothing with it is terrible. To cheat people out with it is terrible, and that's really what this passage is going on there. Because ultimately, and here's the reality when it comes to it, whether in great need or great abundance, we can be content, and that's one of the things that Paul writes to us in the scriptures in the New Testament. I have learned in great affliction. I have learned in great comfort. I have learned in great need. I have learned in great abundance to always be content. And that's what we need to recognize when we look at our finances, is we need to be content. Not only do we want to be content, but even according to James chapter 5, when we read these passages here, we see right there that we are to use what we've been given for the glory of God, whatever the case may be, and that's important. If you look at Micah, and you read Malachi chapter 4 talks about finances. It talks about tithing, and it said, "Shall man rob God? No, yet you rob me in your tithes and your offerings. I tell you, bring your tithe into the storehouse and see if God will not take care of you." And that tends to be overly used, I think, when it comes to prosperity heresy, prosperity teachings in the church. But ultimately, what that principle of that Old Testament passage is saying, look, if you give to God first, He will take care of the rest. And regardless of whatever the amount is, whatever the finances are, whatever your level of wealth is, if you're responsible to God first, that God will take care of the needs. Why? Because you're doing your part and taking care of what God's put before you. We're the hands and feet of God, and that's where our finances come into play. And so James has got some really great things to say about that. I hope that you enjoyed this portion of chapter 5 as we go through it, and that it was very rewarding for you. I know it may have been a little challenging, especially talking about finances and wealth and tithing, and that can be very overwhelming to many, especially when we look at the condition of the economy right now. We look at the condition, with gas prices going up and down and back up. What's important, though, is to recognize that no matter the state of the economy, our duty is to the Lord first. And as we handle our responsibilities in their proper responsibilities in the proper priority, that God will take care of the rest. And that if we hoard, if we stash away, that one indicates a lack of faith in God's provision. I'm not shirking responsibility. We still be responsible. But what I'm saying is that responsibility, if I am hoarding away at the neglect of my biblical responsibilities, then I am showing that I don't trust God to take care of my family. And so my worship for the Lord comes first, and that includes in whatever level of abundance He gives me. So I hope you found that really rewarding. I hope that this was challenging and inspiring. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. My prayer is that God goes with you, that God leads you and guides you, and that as you read the scriptures, that the Word of God comes alive in your heart and it draws you closer to Him. Thank you so much for being a part of this discussion and being a part of what we're doing here. And, join us next time when I get the next opportunity, hopefully in the next week or so, to put forth another study online. And we're going to go further into James chapter 5. We're going to talk about patience in suffering as we go forward in this. So thank you so much for joining us. If you're not a part, if you're listening online or on YouTube, subscribe to the church channel, notify us, let us know you're listening and that you're enjoying the study together. and that you're being a part of this. If you're on the church app, thank you so much for being a part of our daily discipleship and what we have going on here. Again, if you're in the area, join us in person live here at the church. We have Sunday mornings. We have Sunday school at 9, a special worship at 10, and our prayer service at 6 p.m. on Sundays. And then our midweek is on Wednesday nights, 5:30 for our fundraiser dinner meal. And then our groups around the church, they meet at 6:30. Online, live on YouTube at 10. And midweek is always released Thursday mornings. Thank you so much for being a part of this. God bless you. And I hope that you have a wonderful day. Thank you, and God bless. Bye-bye.